In the spring of 2026, a 68-year-old farmer named Merle Osgood stood in the open doorway of a lean-to shed outside Tama County, Iowa, and counted 27 irrigation pumps stacked on a dirt floor that hadn't seen a broom in longer than most of the pumps had sat there. Some of the machines still wore the faded decals of a business that no longer existed. Most hadn't turned over in years, and as of that morning, every single one of them belonged to him, free and clear, because the dealer who'd been piling them there for a decade and a half had finally run out of road. Merle didn't call anybody to celebrate. He didn't post about it, didn't tell the story at the co-op counter the way some men would have. He just walked the row slow, the way he'd walked it 100 times before, running a hand along a housing here, checking a rusted bolt there, the same quiet inventory he'd been keeping since he was younger than his own grandson was now. To understand why a shed full of broken pumps meant as much to him as it did, you had to go back to where it started, and that meant going back 34 years, to a summer when Merle wasn't the man doing the giving. He was the man who needed help. The farm Merle grew up on sat on 160 acres of rolling ground west of town, corn and soybeans mostly. With a scattering of hogs, his father kept more out of habit than profit. Merle was 26 in the summer of 1992. Newly married, farming alongside his father on land that had been in the family 3 generations, and doing the kind of work that leaves a young man with more calluses than cash. That was the summer the well pump on the North Quarter seized up in the middle of the driest stretch anybody could remember, right when the corn needed water worse than it had needed anything all season. Merle didn't have the money for a new pump, and he didn't have the patience to wait 3 weeks for a rebuilt one to come in from Des Moines. So he drove into town to a little equipment dealer on the edge of Carson called Heartland Ag Supply, run by a man named Ray Halverson, hoping there might be something used sitting in the back that he could limp along until harvest paid the bills. What he found in the back lot changed the direction of his whole life, though he didn't know it standing there. Ray had a lean-to shed behind the main building, and in it sat a small graveyard of pumps, machines the dealership had taken back from farmers who couldn't make payments, units traded in on newer models and never resold, a few that customers had simply abandoned rather than pay to have hauled off. Ray told Merle he could have his pick for parts, cheap, since none of them ran and he had no intention of fixing them himself. Merle bought 2 for the price of 1 working unit, took them home, and spent 3 nights in the shop, by lantern light cannibalizing one to bring the other back to life. It worked. The pump ran through the rest of that dry summer without a hiccup, and Merle's corn came in decent that fall, while some of his neighbors' crops burned up in fields with dead wells they hadn't been able to afford to fix. Word got around the way it does in small farm towns, faster than any of it deserved to travel, and by the following spring, Merle had 2 more neighbors asking whether he might take a look at their own dead pumps, before they spent money they didn't have on new ones. Ray Halverson noticed the traffic too. He was a practical man, the kind who didn't waste effort defending a decision that was already making money for somebody, and when Merle came back that second year looking for parts off another dead unit, Ray made him an offer that would end up defining the next decade and a half. He told Merle he could have anything sitting in that lean-to shed, any time, for whatever price the 2 of them agreed felt fair that day. Sometimes $10, sometimes nothing at all if Merle was hauling off something that had been taking up floor space for 2 years already. In exchange, Ray got a place to send the units his own shop didn't have time or interest in touching, and a quiet reputation booster whenever a customer complained about a repair bill and Ray could tell them there was a fellow out west of town who might fix it cheaper if they didn't mind doing business out of a farm shop instead of a storefront. Neither man wrote any of it down. There was no contract, no invoice trail, nothing but a handshake in a gravel lot, and Ray's word that whatever ended up in that shed was Merle's to take, whenever he wanted it, for as long as the arrangement made sense to both of them. That was how business got done around Carson in those years, and neither man saw any reason it needed to be more complicated than that. The pumps kept coming. Not in a flood, not at first. Maybe 4 or 5 a year through the middle 90s. Mostly units that farmers had traded in on something newer, or machines that had failed so badly the dealership's own mechanics didn't think them worth the labor to rebuild. Merle took what interested him and left the rest, and slowly, without either of them planning it that way, The lean-to shed behind Heartland Ag Supply became less a scrap pile and more a kind of standing offer. If Ray had something nobody wanted, Merle would eventually come collect it, sort through it, and either bring it back to life in his own shop or strip it down for parts that went into keeping somebody else's pump running another season. The years that piled the deepest were the hard ones, the way it always goes in farm country. The mid-90s brought a stretch of low grain prices that squeezed a lot of smaller operations right up against the edge of what a bank would tolerate, and more than one neighbor traded a pump in on nothing at all, just handed it over to keep from having to pay to haul it to the scrapyard themselves. Merle picked up 11 units in a single 18-month stretch during that downturn, more than he'd taken in the previous 4 years combined. And it was around then that he started keeping a rough count in a spiral notebook he kept on a shelf above his workbench. Not out of pride, he'd say later, but because after a certain point, a man loses track of what he actually owns if he doesn't write it down somewhere. By the early 2000s, the shed count had climbed past a dozen, and Merle had developed something close to a specialty, though nobody in town would have called it that to his face. He understood centrifugal pumps and turbine pumps the way some men understood livestock, not from a manual but from years of taking them apart and putting them back together until his hands knew the difference between a bad bearing and a cracked impeller before his eyes did. Farmers started coming to him directly instead of going through Ray at all, word having spread that the fellow west of town could often get a dead pump running again for a fraction of what a new one cost, and that he wasn't in any particular hurry to get paid if a family was going through a rough patch. He never charged what the work was worth, not by any measure a shop in town would have used. Mostly he asked for whatever a neighbor could manage, sometimes trade, a few hours of labor come harvest, a hog out of somebody's herd, once an old grain drill that Merle ended up using himself for another 15 years. His wife, Joan, kept a different kind of book than the spiral notebook in the shop, a household ledger that showed, more honestly than Merle ever would have admitted out loud, just how much of that pump work amounted to charity dressed up as a repair business. She never complained about it, not really, though she did point out once, during a particularly lean winter in 2009, that a man could go broke being generous just as easily as he could go broke being careless. Merle told her he knew that. He kept doing it anyway. The drought years hit different, and they hit the shed hardest. The bad stretch of 2012, when half the corn in the county came in barely worth the diesel it took to combine it, sent more units Merle's way in a single season than almost any other year on record. 7 pumps in 4 months, most of them from farmers who'd rather cut their losses on a piece of failed equipment than sink more money chasing a crop that wasn't going to pay for itself either way. Merle worked through that stretch harder than he had in years, not because business was booming, but because half the county needed water and couldn't afford to buy their way to it, and every pump he could coax back to life was one less family staring at a dry well in July with no good options left. Ray Halverson aged through those same years the way most small-town dealership owners did, watching bigger regional chains squeeze his margins on new equipment while his own customer base slowly thinned out, some retiring, some selling to bigger operations that bought their parts and machinery direct from manufacturers instead of a local storefront. He kept the doors of Heartland Ag Supply open longer than plenty of people expected him to, mostly on the strength of a repair department that still did honest work at honest prices, and on a loyalty built up over decades that newer, cheaper competitors 2 counties over couldn't quite match. But the lean-to shed kept filling, because even as Ray's overall business shrank, the trickle of failed and traded-in equipment nobody wanted never really stopped. If anything, it picked up, because fewer farmers could afford new machinery outright, which meant more of them were running equipment right up until it died, rather than trading it in early, the way they might have in flusher years. By 2018, the count in Merle's notebook stood at 19. He'd fixed and returned to service more than half the units that had ever come through that shed, either back to the original owner, sold cheap to somebody else who needed one, or kept running quietly on Merle's own ground as backup in case one of his own pumps ever failed at the worst possible moment. The ones still sitting on the dirt floor behind Ray's shop by then were mostly the hard cases, units with cracked housings that would need welding work Merle didn't have the equipment for, or motors burned out so badly that rebuilding them cost more in parts than a used replacement would run. He kept them anyway, some for parts, some out of a stubbornness he couldn't fully explain even to himself, the same instinct that had made him buy 2 dead pumps instead of 1, back in 1992, rather than admit he might need to ask for help outright. His grandson, a boy named Tyler who'd been coming out to the shop on weekends since he was old enough to hold a wrench without dropping it, was the one who eventually talked Merle into keeping better records than a water-stained spiral notebook. Tyler was 17 by 2022, more comfortable with a spreadsheet than most of the men his grandfather did business with were comfortable with a phone, and he spent one long Saturday afternoon photographing every pump in the shed, cataloging serial numbers where they were still legible, and building a simple digital record of what had come in, what had gone back out, and what condition each remaining unit was in. Merle grumbled about the fuss but didn't stop him, and admitted, once it was done, that it was probably about time somebody besides him could make sense of what was actually sitting back there. It was Tyler, too, who first noticed something shifting at Heartland Ag Supply, the kind of thing a teenager picks up on faster than the adults around him sometimes do. Ray's son, Curtis, had taken over day-to-day management of the store a few years earlier as Ray's health started slowing him down, and Curtis ran the place with a different set of pressures than his father ever had to reckon with. The wider farm economy through the middle of the 2020s had turned harder on small operations like Heartland than it had been in years. Tariffs on imported equipment and replacement parts had driven costs up on nearly everything Curtis stocked. Interest rates sat high enough that farmers were financing new machinery more cautiously than they had in a decade, and margins on crop prices had stayed thin enough that a lot of Curtis's regular customers were putting off equipment purchases entirely, patching along what they already owned instead of buying new. Curtis wasn't a bad businessman. He was just running a small-town dealership through one of the tighter stretches the industry had seen in years, competing against bigger suppliers who could absorb rising costs in ways a single-location shop in Carson never could. Tyler mentioned to his grandfather, sometime in early 2025, that the parking lot at Heartland had looked thinner than usual the last few times he'd driven past, and that a couple of the display units that used to sit out front, advertising new equipment, hadn't been replaced in a while. Merle didn't think much of it at the time. Small dealerships had quiet stretches. He'd seen Ray ride out worse. But by the fall of that year, the quiet stretch had turned into something else. Curtis called Merle directly in October, which wasn't unusual on its own. The two men had done enough business over the years that a phone call between them didn't need much preamble. But the tone of this one was different from anything that had passed between the Halverson family and the Osgood family in 30 years of handshake arrangements. Curtis told him, plainly, that the store wasn't going to make it through another full year the way things were trending. Rising costs on the parts side, financing rates that had scared off half his usual equipment buyers, and a shrinking customer base that had been thinning out for a decade had finally caught up with a business that had been running on thinner and thinner margins for longer than Curtis liked to admit. He said his father, now well into his 80s and mostly retired from the day-to-day, had told him to make whatever call made sense, and that the call Curtis had landed on was to close Heartland Ag Supply for good sometime in the coming spring. Merle sat with that news longer than he sat with most things. He'd known Ray Halverson for 34 years by then, longer than he'd known some of his own cousins, and the shed behind that dealership had shaped more of Merle's adult life than almost anything else he could name outside his own family. He asked Curtis what was going to happen to everything still sitting in that lean-to, the handful of units that had accumulated since Tyler's last full inventory, machines Merle hadn't gotten around to collecting yet, still technically Ray's property, under an arrangement that had never once been written down on paper. Curtis told him what his father had told him to say, word for word, like he'd been rehearsing it. Whatever was in that shed had been Merle's the whole time, as far as Ray was concerned, whether Merle had gotten around to hauling it off yet or not. Ray wanted it made clear, before the doors closed for good, that there wasn't going to be any liquidation sale, any auction, any stranger from 2 counties overhauling off 34 years of history for scrap value. The arrangement the two men had shaken hands on back in 1992 held all the way through to the end, and Curtis said his father had been firm about that point in a way he wasn't firm about much else these days. The dealership closed its doors in March of 2026, on a gray Tuesday that drew a smaller crowd than a business with that much history in the county probably deserved, mostly old customers and a few longtime employees standing around the empty showroom floor, saying the kinds of things people say when something that had always just been there stops being there. Merle came by 2 days later with his truck and trailer, Tyler riding along to help load, and the two of them spent a full afternoon clearing out the lean-to shed for the last time, not picking through it the way Merle usually did, taking what interested him and leaving the rest, but taking everything, every last pump, because there wasn't going to be another chance to come back for what he left behind. 27 units all told. Once Merle and Tyler finished counting them out on the dirt floor of Merle's own shed that evening, cross-referencing against Tyler's spreadsheet from a few years back, and adding in what had accumulated since. Some were units Merle had picked out on purpose over the years, and simply never gotten around to hauling home. A handful were newer than anything that had ever passed through the shed before. Trade-ins from the last couple of hard seasons that Curtis's declining customer base had left him no good way to resell. And a few were the same stubborn hard cases that had been sitting on that dirt floor since before Tyler was born. Cracked housings and burned motors that Merle had kept out of a habit he'd never quite managed to break. What made the moment land differently than it might have 30 years earlier wasn't just the sentiment of it, though there was plenty of that. It was the timing. The same pressures that had finally closed Heartland Ag Supply's doors, tight margins, high equipment costs, a drought that had left a good stretch of the county's cattle and irrigation operations scrambling for every dollar of efficiency they could find, were the exact pressures making a barn full of repairable used pumps worth more to Merle's neighbors in the spring of 2026 than they might have been worth in almost any year since 1992. New irrigation pumps had climbed in price faster than a lot of smaller operations could comfortably absorb. Parts costs on imported components had risen, right along with everything else squeezing farm budgets that year, and more than a few of Merle's neighbors were staring down a dry summer with equipment they couldn't afford to replace outright. Merle didn't turn the collection into a business, not in any way that would have shown up on a balance sheet. He did what he'd always done, just at a scale he'd never managed before. Over the following months, he worked through the 27 units the same patient way he'd worked through every pump that had ever landed in that shed, rebuilding what could be rebuilt, stripping the hard cases for parts that kept other machines running, and quietly making it known around the county that anybody staring at a dead well and an irrigation bill they couldn't stomach ought to come talk to him before they signed anything at a dealership 2 counties over. By early summer, 6 of the 27 were back in the ground on 6 different farms, most of them belonging to families who'd been putting off a repair or a replacement they genuinely couldn't afford, patched along on wells that had been failing slowly for a season or two, while the owners hoped the problem would somehow resolve itself. Merle charged what he'd always charged, which was to say, not much, and not always money. One young couple who'd bought into a small operation 2 years earlier and were still climbing out from under their startup debt paid him back in fencing labor over 3 straight weekends instead of cash. And Merle told anyone who asked that the fence work was worth more to him at his age than the money would have been anyway. Tyler, by then 18, and weighing a decision about whether to head off to a 2-year ag mechanics program in the fall or stay closer to home and keep working alongside his grandfather, found himself spending most of his free time out in that shed that spring, and it was somewhere in the middle of rebuilding the 9th or 10th unit together that he told Merle, half joking, that between the two of them, they'd basically become the repair department Heartland Ag Supply used to run, minus the storefront and the overhead. Merle didn't laugh, not right away. He said that wasn't really a joke, when you looked at it straight on, and that maybe it was worth thinking about seriously instead of as something that had just happened to them by accident. That conversation didn't resolve into anything official that spring. No sign hung out by the road, no name painted on the shed door, but it planted something that both men kept coming back to over the following months, especially as word kept spreading, and more neighbors kept showing up at the gate, asking whether Merle might have anything that could get their well running again, before the next dry stretch caught them flat-footed. Whatever it turned into eventually, it was already doing the thing it had always done since the summer of 1992, keeping water moving on ground that needed it, for families who couldn't always afford to buy their way out of trouble the easy way. Ray Halverson came out to see the shed once that summer, driven by his son on a Saturday afternoon in June, moving slower than he used to, but still sharp enough to walk the row of pumps and recognize half of them by sight, telling small stories about which farmer had traded which unit in and why, filling in pieces of history that even Merle's own notebook had never captured. He stood at the end of the row for a long while without saying much, the way old men do when a piece of their life's work has ended up somewhere they didn't fully expect it to land. And then he told Merle, plainly, that he was glad it had all gone to somebody who was going to keep using it the way it was meant to be used, instead of somebody who was just going to let it rust. Merle told him that was the whole idea from the start, back when Ray had first waved him toward that lean-to shed in the summer of 1992, and told a broke 26-year-old farmer to take what he needed. Ray said he remembered that morning better than Merle probably realized, and that he'd known even then, watching a young man dig through a pile of dead equipment looking for anything he could make work, that the two of them had struck a deal that was going to outlast a handshake in a gravel lot by a lot longer than either of them expected. Neither man could have said, standing in that lot in 1992, that the arrangement would run 34 years, survive a farm crisis and a couple of droughts, and a whole generation of changing equipment, and end with a barn full of pumps helping a new round of farmers through a hard stretch nobody had seen coming when it all started. But that was, in the end, exactly what it had become. Not a business, not really, and not charity either. Just two families and then three, keeping water running on land that needed it, one broken pump at a time, for as long as it took. If you want to see which pump Merle and Tyler bring back to life next, and whose well it ends up saving, stick around. Because there's still a row of hard cases sitting in that shed, and neither one of them is done working through it yet. The barn had stood on the Halverson family property since 1964. Built from rough-cut oak and hand-set fieldstone, it had weathered 11 presidents, 3 roof replacements, and 1 tornado that took the neighbor's silo but left this barn standing. By the time this story starts, it hadn't held a single bale of hay in almost a decade. It was, according to 3 separate bank appraisers, worth nothing. Not worth less, worth nothing. Zero. In the language of agricultural lending, the barn was labeled a case of functional obsolescence, a real appraisal term that means a structure costs more to bring up to code than it would ever return in value. The wiring was knob and tube, a system phased out of residential and agricultural use by the 1950s because the insulation, often cloth or rubber, degrades over decades and becomes a fire hazard, especially in a structure packed with dry hay and wood dust. No modern insurer would cover it. No bank would lend against it. On paper, the barn was a liability waiting to burn. This is where Emma Halverson enters the story. 14 years old, a freshman in the local FFA chapter, Future Farmers of America, a program that's been training rural teenagers in agricultural science and skilled trades since 1928. Emma had grown up watching her father, Tom, try and fail to get financing to save the barn. 3 regional banks turned him down in the same calendar year. Not because the land wasn't valuable, not because the family didn't have equity, because the barn itself, the physical structure her grandfather built, was considered dead weight on the balance sheet. They kept telling my dad the numbers didn't work, Emma would later say. Nobody looked at the barn like it was actually a building. They looked at it like it was already a pile of rubble somebody hadn't hauled away yet. Tom Halverson had 42 dairy goats, a small flock of laying hens, and a hay operation that fed both. What he didn't have was covered, wired storage space to keep his equipment dry, his feed protected from moisture, and his hens laying through the winter months when daylight drops below the 14 hours a laying hen's reproductive cycle needs to maintain consistent egg production. That's not sentiment. That's basic poultry biology. Hens are photoperiodic, meaning their hormone cycles respond directly to light exposure. Commercial operations solve this with supplemental lighting on timers. Without power in the barn, Tom's flock was laying at maybe 60% of its potential through the winter, and he was losing real income because of it. So when the 3rd bank said no, Emma didn't go to a 4th bank. She went to her FFA advisor, a woman named Diane Cortland, who'd spent 11 years teaching agricultural mechanics before she ever set foot in a classroom. And Emma asked her a question that would end up rerouting the entire trajectory of her family's finances. If the wiring is the only problem, Why can't I just learn to fix the wiring? It wasn't naive. Emma had already spent 2 years in FFA's agricultural mechanics program, which, depending on the chapter, can include hands-on units in small engine repair, welding, and basic residential and agricultural electrical systems, taught under supervision and aligned with National Electrical Code standards. She wasn't proposing to rewire a barn out of nowhere. She was proposing to finish what she'd already started learning on a building she'd known her whole life. Diane didn't say yes right away. She made a phone call first, to a retired electrician named Hank Pruitt, who'd wired half the barns and outbuildings in the county over a 40-year career, and now spent his retirement mentoring FFA students on real infrastructure projects. Hank drove out to the property, walked the barn from foundation to rafter, and gave Tom Halverson a number that made the family go quiet: $22,000. That was the going rate to bring a structure that size up to modern agricultural electrical code. New service panel, new circuits, waterproof and dust-rated fixtures rated for a livestock environment, proper grounding, and GFCI protection in the areas near water sources, which is now required under most state adaptations of the National Electrical Code for agricultural buildings. Tom didn't have $22,000. That was the whole problem the banks had already made clear. But Hank made an offer that changed everything. He'd donate his time as a licensed supervisor if Emma was serious about doing the physical work herself, under his direct oversight, using materials the family could afford to buy incrementally. It's worth being precise here, because this detail matters, and it's not exaggeration for drama. In most states, a miner cannot legally pull permits or perform unsupervised electrical work, and any wiring done in a barn used commercially has to be inspected and signed off by a licensed electrician before it's legal to energize. Emma wasn't freelancing in defiance of the system. She was working inside it, with a mentor who held the license, doing the physical labor while Hank verified every connection, every circuit load calculation, and every inspection point. That distinction became the actual engine of the story. Because what Emma was doing wasn't a workaround, it was an apprenticeship. The oldest model in the skilled trades, still legally recognized, still functioning exactly the way it functioned when Emma's grandfather first learned to work with his hands. The first month was the unglamorous part nobody puts in the highlight reel. Before a single new wire could go in, the old knob and tube system had to come out completely. Every strand of it, some of it snaked through joists that hadn't been touched since Lyndon Johnson was president. Emma spent weeks in the rafters with a headlamp and a respirator, because old barn insulation and decades of dust and rodent activity in enclosed wall cavities is a genuine respiratory hazard, not a minor inconvenience. She cataloged every existing circuit with masking tape and a notebook before removing anything, a habit Hank drilled into her on day one. Never demolish what you haven't mapped. Then came the math, and this is where the story stops being about grit and starts being about competence. A barn housing 42 dairy goats and a laying flock has real electrical load requirements. Lighting circuits calculated for the photoperiod needs of the hens, a dedicated circuit for a water heater to keep the goats' water from freezing in winter, because goats, like most livestock, reduce water intake dramatically when water is near freezing, which in turn reduces feed intake and can trigger digestive problems, and separate circuits for any future equipment like a milking machine vacuum pump, which pulls a specific and non-negotiable amperage that has to be accounted for in the panel design or the whole system trips under load. Emma didn't invent these numbers. She learned to calculate them the same way any apprentice electrician does. Total up the wattage of every fixture and appliance, apply the National Electrical Code's demand factors for continuous versus non-continuous loads, and size the circuit breakers and wire gauge to match. Never undersized, because undersized wire heating under load is exactly the fire risk that killed the old system in the first place. Hank checked every single calculation before Emma was allowed to run wire. Every joint, every splice. The barn got a new 100-amp sub-panel fed from the main house service, properly grounded to code, with individual breakers for lighting, the water heater circuit, a dedicated 20-amp circuit for equipment, and GFCI protection on every outlet within reach of a hose or a water trough, because the moisture in a working livestock barn is a completely different environment from a living room, and the code treats it that way for good reason. It took 4 months. Not because the wiring itself was that complicated, but because Emma was doing it around school, around chores, and around a county electrical inspector's schedule, since every stage, rough-in, before the walls closed up, and final, had to be inspected and passed before moving forward. That inspection requirement is exactly why the finished barn is legally, provably safe, not just safe by intention. The county inspector who signed off on the final walkthrough had been doing that job for 18 years and later told a local paper it was some of the cleanest amateur-supervised work he'd seen come through in a decade. When the barn was finally re-energized, the first thing that happened wasn't dramatic. Tom Halverson flipped a switch, and the overhead lights came on in a barn that had sat dark for the better part of 10 years. Emma has said the sound she remembers most isn't applause or celebration. It's the hens. Within about 2 weeks of consistent supplemental lighting extending their daylight exposure to the roughly 16 hours commercial layers typically get, the flock's egg production climbed back toward its genetic potential. That's not a metaphor. That's measurable output that put real dollars back into the family's income within a single production cycle. The goats benefited too, in a less visible but equally real way. With a working heated waterer, water intake stayed consistent through the winter, which supported normal rumen function and feed conversion, the biological process by which a goat's forestomach ferments fibrous feed into usable energy. Cold water intake, and the corresponding drop in it during freezing months, is a documented contributor to digestive slowdowns in small ruminants. It's not the kind of detail that makes headlines. It's the kind of detail that makes or breaks a small operation's margins. And the equipment storage the family gained wasn't small either. A dry, wired, insulated barn meant hay could be stored without the moisture damage that had been costing them a percentage of their feed supply every single year. Mold growth in stored hay above roughly 20% moisture content isn't just a quality issue, it's a genuine health hazard for livestock, and a fire risk in its own right from the heat generated by microbial activity in damp hay. A functioning barn solved a problem that had been quietly bleeding the family's feed budget for a decade. Word got out the way it does in small agricultural communities, slowly, and then all at once. A regional Farm Bureau newsletter picked up the story. Then a local news segment. Then, because the internet works the way it works, it reached people who had never set foot on a dairy goat operation in their lives, but who recognized something true in it. A 14-year-old girl had solved a problem that 3 financial institutions had declared unsolvable. Not through a loophole, not through luck, but through supervised, code-compliant, legitimately learned skilled labor. What makes this story worth telling isn't that a teenager is capable of hard work. Plenty of teenagers are. What makes it worth telling is what it reveals about how value gets measured. 3 appraisers looked at that barn through a lens that could only register depreciation, a structure aging past the point of algorithmic recovery. None of them accounted for the possibility that the cost to repair line item on their spreadsheet could be replaced by an apprenticeship, a mentor with 4 decades of hands-on knowledge, and a 14-year-old willing to spend a winter in the rafters with a headlamp. Emma Halverson isn't finished. She's continuing through FFA's agricultural mechanics pathway, and Hank Pruitt has said, on record, that if she wants to pursue a formal electrician's apprenticeship after high school, he'll write the recommendation himself. Tom Halverson's operation is running at full capacity for the first time in a decade, and the barn, the one 3 banks said was worth nothing, is standing exactly where it stood since 1964, doing exactly what it was built to do. The lesson underneath all of it isn't really about barns, or wiring, or even banks. It's about the difference between a system that only knows how to calculate loss and a person who is willing to learn, under real supervision, with real standards, how to build something back. That's not a fairy tale. That's a documented, inspected, code-compliant barn with the paperwork to prove it, and a 14-year-old who earned every bit of it.